Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you for coming. I'm Amanda Mackenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, Australia's people-powered climate organisation. And our job, as you probably know, is to bring evidence-based climate information to the public, to decision makers, and push for solutions. So I'm really glad you can join us this evening. We're having a conversation with our expert speakers, Greg Bourne, Alex Engelmelin, and Dana Arndt. But before I get going, I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge the deep and enduring connection to country. A few weeks ago, I was speaking to a Kabi Kabi man, Tyrone, and he spoke about the seven generations principle for his culture. He talked about three generations before, three generations after, and that generation in the middle that provides the stewardship and relationship between the two, connecting the knowledge and the wisdom of the past with the promise of the future and connecting and stewarding the relationship to country on which everyone depends. And I thought it was just such a powerful articulation of that concept and the invitation from Indigenous cultures for all of us to start thinking a little bit more long term about what our role is. So I invite you all to share in the chat where you join us from tonight. And just as a little bit of ground rules or housekeeping, encourage everyone to use the chat if you want to jump in and pose a question or a thought, and of course, in a constructive and respectful way. You can also submit a question via the Q&A box, and we've got some of our team members in the background furiously working to answer any of those questions. And of course, as usual, our discussion tonight is being recorded, and all of the links and resources that will pop in the chat during the discussion will all be sent out after the discussion later on. So you'll have access to all of that. So, just in terms of giving some context for the conversation tonight, obviously we're meeting at a challenging time. The US-led war on Iran has caused immense suffering and shockwaves around the world through energy markets and supply chains. And of course, in Australia, this has driven up fuel and electricity prices at the same time as many were already struggling with the cost of living. And I'm sure everyone's experienced that, whether at the petrol station or whether at the grocery store, etc. So last week's federal budget exposed many of those tensions. We were critical of the budget because although it did maintain support for clean energy, we felt that the handouts of 19 billion in both subsidies and lost revenue from the fossil fuel industry was a real missed opportunity, particularly in this context, when we're dealing with these global price shocks, that this is the opportunity to really double down on renewable energy and electrification of our transportation system. But at the same time, the opposition has argued that in their budget reply speech, we should do more drilling, we should do more digging, and that's going to be their direction to the next election. So that's despite the fact that our oil reserves are already basically exhausted. So we have a difficult situation on our hands. But in moments of crisis and instability, that's precisely the time when you can get a whole lot of movement. And the fossil fuel industry knows that. We see their playbook being executed on all the time. You might have seen right now that the gas industry has launched a major new public advertising campaign, for instance. But of course, it's an opportunity for us to come together and think deeply and act swiftly to be pushing forward for our policy agenda, as well as shifting the public narrative, which we've already been working hard on over the last few months. So tonight we're going to articulate that fossil fuel playbook that I described, take you inside the fights that we're working on to counter it, and share with you how we think we can shift the conversation and that hopefully you can help us in your community, in your workplace, with the people that you care about. So we hope we go away tonight with a shared understanding of what we're up against and what we're doing about it and how we can all work together to help. So to kick us off first, I wanted to introduce you to Climate Councillor Greg Bourne, who you may well be familiar with. He's been doing a huge amount of media in the last few months on these issues. He's a former president of BP Australasia, served as an energy advisor to Margaret Thatcher, worked in the oil and gas industry, and then moved out of that industry into tackling climate change and environmental issues, and has been in working for decades in that fight. So, Greg, talk us through this playbook that I described and what history tells us about how to get this moment right.
Look, thanks very much, Amanda. And I think, everyone has to learn from history, and I am unfortunately steeped in the history of oil, both sort of living in those places, but also having read so much of it over time. So I talk about the global insecurity of energy supply because when it's just out there, no one's worried about it at all and do very, very little. But behind the scenes, a huge amount of insecurity exists. It exists because will oil and gas, LNG, get out through the particular choke points? The one on the left shows you, coming out through the Red Sea, coming out through the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and the one on the right shows the other ones, which we're not really talking about very much at the moment, but the choke points in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. What we see really here is just history of empires fighting over the same oil. The map here is from 1907. You can see the Straits of Hormuz there with the little red cross there. The cartoon on the right is from Punch, and it's basically showing the Russian bear, the British lion sitting on the Persian cat. And the lines over Persia are basically the divisions between the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and the other bits they couldn't work out. On the left, coming in, is the eagle. And basically, from around about 1907, we see a clash of empires and a clash and a thirst for the oil, with America being the latest one to come in, and they came basically into Saudi Arabia. But basically, the power there was basically the big world powers. It was known as the Great Game, and the pressure they put on the places like Persia were enormous, even able to split them up. Let's move on to the next slide. What happens? So what you actually see, oil prices from about you know, 1900 up to 1950, 1960, they're pretty much flat throughout the world. And basically, these countries we see in the Middle East had no power over the great powers, the big governments. And basically, the oil companies, whether they were American, whether they were French, whether they were British, um, all went in and basically, you would say, exploited the oil that was in there. The first shock is coming 73, 74, followed quickly afterwards by 78, 79. Now, those prices are rocketing up. The big effects that occur are world recessions. Some of you will remember the interest rates going up to 17, 18, 19, 20%. It was pretty hard to buy a house then. It really was hard, very, very hard. But the response from the oil companies was, we will use the phrase drill, baby, drill. It's not what we used at the time, but it was basically, we can't get the oil out of the Middle East right now. So exploring off West Africa, off the east coast of Brazil, deep water, the Gulf of Mexico, in the North Sea, the technology moved forward. Because the price was high, you could explore for anything. And that's what happened. And eventually, the oil price begins to come down again. So that's the first big shock period. The second big shock period is around, following on from 9/11, and then the prices go rocket up again, global financial crisis. And the response there was somewhat different. The response was clearly another recession that went around the world. But now you begin to see a different response. China begins to say, well, we can't be beholden on Middle Eastern oil forever. Our economy is growing. We need to do something different. And they start getting into the renewable business in really a big way. And so the graph on the right shows how big they become. And it's an economic outburst from China in a big way, saying, we need renewable energy as we go forward. We cannot work on having the choke points kill us every single time it happens. So that you have a first crisis, a second crisis, and we now have a third crisis. And let's remember, they are crises of people dying, people being killed every day, as well as us not being able to fill up our cars or whatever else. But the way I would look at this particular one is, finally people are beginning to realize that the power, the economic power of Iran it's an odd economic power, but the ability to close off a choke point is there, and it will come back again. So, the once bitten, twice shy, we've been thrice bitten now. We will have another oil crisis without doubt in a decade. This one is going to last a lot longer, I believe. But we get into a situation of how can we, as we think about climate change, begin to respond positively? Of course, we need to get out of oil, gas, and we just have to do that. But we can push the renewable future. We need to do it from both a climate point of view and from a geopolitical point of view. And that, I think, is where optimism comes in. Let's move on to the last of the slides. 100 grubby years of oil company interference. This is a cartoon from Tintin, and it's a Tintin cartoon dated 1937, Tintin and the Broken Ear, playing countries off against one another. And in the captions there, you basically see effectively Shell Oil and Exxon playing off Paraguay and Bolivia, starting a war in order to get the oil interests underneath those two territories, starting a war. That is what happened. You can actually go and find the details of it. But playing countries off against each other and playing the situation of, well, Australia, if you want to drill for oil, we'll put money in. But actually, we've got other places. If you don't give us a really, really good tax break, we'll go to South Africa. We'll go to somewhere else. And that has happened on a continuous basis, linking themselves into the government and the community. But it's always about, we'll only bring our capital if you basically give us your oil and gas primarily for free. And then, lobbying relentlessly behind closed doors. It never stops, and public campaigning and threatening. So the last two little bits I'll point to here is this. In the early part of this year, I think it's January, Murray Auchincloss, who was the CEO of BP, the company I worked for very many years, basically said, stuff it. We're going to drill, baby, drill. We're not going to do anything with regard to renewable energy anymore. It was just not worth it at all. 3 months later, Meg O'Neill, who was the CEO of Woodside at that particular point, said pretty much the same thing. The energy system, the renewable energy system is not going to work. So we want our gas to go out, and indeed to 2070 is what she wanted to say. Auchincloss went, Meg O'Neill has now become the CEO of BP internationally. So the playbook is just handed generation after generation, decade after decade, CEO to CEO. They know what they're doing and they keep doing it.
Thanks, Greg. It's a really powerful reflection on the decades that have gone before now and the reaction to the energy crisis, and seeing that that graph of how China reacted is so powerful. Thank you. Well, I'm going to pass on to Alex now. Alex Engelmelin, who you may remember from other webinars, is our advocacy director, and she's going to take us inside what's being decided right now, what things are being debated within the Parliament, and where our community strategy can make a difference.
Hi, everyone. Great to be with you again. And thanks, Greg. Greg's just taken us through the long game here, a century of the same kind of fossil fuel playbook. What I want to do right now with you is bring that into the present day, because what Greg's described isn't history. It's the budget we just had. It's the decisions being made by in Canberra right now, and it's the fights that are coming in the next 6 to 12 months. So let's take a look inside that. The current crisis has ironically done us a favor in one sense. It's made something undeniable that the fossil fuel industry has spent decades trying to obscure, and that's that Australia's energy security is completely tied to volatile global markets. So our prices, our supply are tied to global oil, gas, and coal markets that we don't control. And when the prices spike globally, Australians pay. And that's not an energy security strategy. That's a hostage situation. However, happily, there's a solution. We can power ourselves with renewables. And sun and wind don't have a global spot price. As we know, they're ours. And that's real energy security. Happily, it's also a solution to the climate crisis. This is the core argument that we're making as an organisation, and it's landing. People get it. Australians get it. And here's the thing, they don't just get it, they're acting on it. The transition's already happening and the data's striking. So electric vehicles are now saving Australia around 50 million litres of fuel every week, and sales have escalated exponentially since the crisis started. In just the last 4 months alone, grid scale batteries have cut gas use by the annual consumption equivalent of more than 160,000 Victorian homes. They're not a future technology. They're cutting gas use to record lows today. So when people say the transition isn't working, show them this slide. We've got similar slides on home batteries too. It is working. The question is really whether we accelerate it or whether we let the fossil fuel industry slow it down. So that brings me to the federal budget. We assess the budget against what Australia actually needs to take back control of its energy security and also address climate harm. And our honest snapshot really is that we didn't make much ground, but we largely retained it. So there are some key commitments on large-scale renewables, home batteries, EV discount were all largely retained, and the government will deliver on those existing commitments. And that's no small thing in a context where there's a huge deficit and every portfolio had to make quite significant cuts. So overall, our assessment was it fell well short of the moment. But what is there and what was retained is there because of strong public pressure for it to be there. I think it was clear where the fossil fuel industry got their way. There were some short-term measures to manage fuel supply, but some concerning fundings to support gas investment and also oil exploration. There was no tax on gas exports to ensure gas corporations pay their fair share. And there was no end to diesel tax breaks to our largest mining companies. That is slowing down our electrification of heavy industry. So what this tells us about how the fight with industry works, well, every green tick and circle that you see here on this slide exists because pressure was applied, but every red cross tells us exactly where we need to push harder. So the budget isn't the end of the story, obviously. There are major fights live right now and over the next 6 to 12 months, where the outcome is genuinely uncertain and genuinely influenced by the amount of pressure that we can apply. So fight one for us is the safeguard mechanism review. You would all be familiar with that policy being the cap on emissions from our climate pollution from our biggest industrial polluters. That chart kind of shows you that it controls kind of 30% of Australia's pollution, our biggest emitters. It's up for review this year, and the fossil fuel lobby is already pushing to weaken it. We'll be pushing hard to strengthen it, including ending loopholes being used by big coal and gas to keep polluting and highlighting the cost of inaction. We'll also be fighting to accelerate renewables and electrification policy. Things like transport electrification, heavy vehicles, public transport. And the public appetite is there, but we need to ensure that it's backed in by government and that we're making the case loudly and clearly for those things. On the flip side of that, we need to be loudly advocating for the deceleration of fossil fuel production and an end to fossil fuel subsidies. So we need to lock in reforms to do that, and the diesel fuel tax credit reform and some big coal, oil and gas projects in the pipeline. There's some significant new ones being considered right now, like Browse. The fossil fuel industry will use the energy crisis narrative to argue that these projects are necessary for our energy security. We'll be there to counter that narrative with evidence every time it appears, and we'll be doing everything we can to stop governments approving these polluting projects. So what to watch out for next from the climate delayers? So, big oil, coal and gas will be there fighting tooth and nail in all these large policy fights and using their proxies in both parliament and also media to get what they want. They'll use the same old narrative playbook. We'll see the same old players in parliament trotting out their lines. And the ongoing fuel crisis and the noise from the industry, it does make this a really challenging time to cut through on climate. But this moment also does present some opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be there. So if we're strategic, we pivot effectively, and Diana will shortly be touching base on how we're doing this in the narrative and messaging space. If we stay the course, and we're confident that we can get progress on climate. Ultimately, we know these things are true. We have the facts, we've got the evidence, and we'll continue to build and publish that, put it directly in front of journalists and decision makers. The other thing that's true is public pressure does move governments. So I know it can feel hard to believe right now and sometimes, but the green ticks on that budget slide exist because of it. Government ministers and MPs are human beings who respond to their communities. And with our community of all of you, 500 Australians behind us, we can demonstrate to a minister or a backbencher what Australians want, and it changes what's politically possible. That's not spin, that's how it works. And you will have real opportunities to engage over the next 6 months with us. As the safeguard review happens, as diesel fuel tax credit reform is debated, as these big polluting projects come up for decision, we will need your voices and your support, sharing our research, signing petitions, talking to your family and friends, getting fact-based stories out in the media, writing to a meeting with your MPs. You know, the most powerful thing in those conversations is a constituent who knows the facts and is not going away. So that's the landscape, real fights, real stakes, real opportunities for you to join us to shape outcomes. The fossil fuel industry knows what it wants and fights hard for it every day. So do we. And while we don't have their resources, we have something better. We have you. Dinah, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. That's a really inspiring end to that presentation too. It's 100% too. This can feel like a real David and Goliath battle, and that's because it is. And as Greg has said in the media a lot recently, like the fossil fuel industry has their back against the wall, and that's when they'll be fighting tooth and nail. And it's critical for us to be stepping up at the same time. So I'm going to put pass to Dinah now, who's going to shift the conversation a little bit into how we have that conversation with the Australian public and how you can be involved in that as well.
Thanks, Amanda. And before I jump into some specific research insights, I also wanted to underscore the importance of your opinion. Politics is often a game of calculation. They think, what is the public willing to accept? Who is going to kick up a stink on this? And are they a political threat? Public opinion is really central to defining what's inside and outside of what is often referred to as the Overton window, which is pictured here. And by introducing ideas that can initially be seen as radical or taboo, repeatedly discussing them, you can actually move them from concepts that then suddenly seem really sensible. And we've certainly seen a lot of those over time. But of course, as Alex and Greg have both made it really clear, we're not the only ones that are trying to shift this window and enlarge this window to encompass different things. And we have been given a really scary insight into the types of resources and efforts that the fossil fuel industry does have to keep the status quo in place. We can move to the next slide. For some time, cost of living has been the number one issue for a really large swathe of Australians. As one researcher put it, there's cost of living, daylight, and any other issue right now. But when we went and talked to suburban voters, that's middle and outer suburbs in some of our biggest cities, the acuteness with which those voters are now feeling that cost of living pressure should not be overstated. And I think that gives, really good context, I guess, in terms of where the people are at and that we often want to talk to. And you can see in that left-hand side speech bubble that for a lot of people, they're just really under huge pressure and trying to hang on. And from the focus group research we've been doing, the other really consistent finding was that voters across the board blame one thing for those cost of living pressures and for life being so tough. And it is not renewables, but corporate predation or greed. So that was consistent across all ages, all genders, both conservative, even One Nation voters and progressive voters. And they're really looking for governments to step in and act in their interest. So in this context, our key tip is to anchor all our issues and messages in this concept of economic fairness. Next slide, please. Because people are doing it so tough and feeling really insecure at the moment, they are willing to consider quite a number of things because they're desperate to see any solution or possible solution to the pain and suffering that they're in at the moment. And they also push back to a degree on ideas that are presented as kind of an all in or anything that kind of might endanger the options that might be out there. So you can see from these two speech bubbles on the left-hand side, that was polling that was done in March. Unsurprisingly, it was ran in the News Corp publications, where 69% of voters, or more than two-thirds, backed more local oil drilling for security reasons, even if it meant more pollution. On the right-hand side, you can see just as many, if not more, people that are wanting to see government help them and others buy things like electric vehicles, home batteries, or solar. So there's really strong support for any possible viable solution. And the reason why people think that oil drilling could be viable is they have major knowledge gaps. So they don't know that Australia has basically, as Amanda said, exhausted our conventional crude oil reserves. And they don't understand that it takes many, many years to get oil supplies online. And they don't understand that were we even to build a refinery in Australia, you'd obviously need to run the thing on imported oil. So it doesn't solve the problem that we have. So that's why we recommend framing things like electric vehicles, battery, and solar as a way of giving people, number one, back control, and number two, protecting them against price rises. And that contrasts with this idea that, particularly when it comes to oil, we are putting all our eggs in this massive fossil fuel basket case. And that is not an idea that most people will go for. So when we can present clean energy and electrification as more of a shield, and certainly when we present these types of ideas that for us probably aren't relatively new, but for many people are still sort of getting awareness of how viable these solutions are, that we can present them as more of an expansion of their options. And that's really appealing to a lot of people. Next slide. And I'd always remember that we are actually in the vast majority here. So we do have a mandate when it comes to fast tracking climate solutions. We know that when you present an either or situation, more people will prefer that the government invest in renewable energy over other options like coal and gas. In parts of our community, particularly those aged between 25 and 44, we're also seeing a rise in climate concern, mostly driven by worsening extreme weather. And while half of us think the government is doing stuff on climate, we also think they could be doing a lot more on the issue. So it's always really, really helpful to remind people what the majority of Australians actually do think. And by expressing our own views on these issues, we're actually making that mandate really clear to each other as well as to decision makers. And I've got a particular example up here because it can be easy to overlook just how powerful and important your voice is in the climate fight. It's an absolute weapon. So researchers have consistently found that the most trusted messengers are, in addition to experts, family, friends, and peers. So that's you. And if you went to the regions and asked people there, what do you think about the renewable energy rollout? Two-thirds of people are in support. But if you ask them how many of your fellow neighbours in your community support this shift, they think that about half as many actually support it. And that is the perception gap, which exists on renewable energy, but which we've also seen in the early days of the so-called climate wars when we had really high-profile politicians, shock jocks and the like, really sort of alter our perception of how many of us who were in support were actually out there versus how many of us were out there that were in opposition. So one of the most powerful things you can do is to actually share your story. It could be your neighbour's story, or someone in your community or something cool that you've seen in the news from other communities. And that might be people buying solar to save money. It might be putting on a battery to stick it to the energy companies, or it might be jumping on a train as an act of national security, but is also fun. So when we add all those stories and voices together, we really can shift the narrative and put pressure on for policymakers to do the change that we know is so necessary. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dinah. That brings us to the end of the presentations from each of our panelists. Thank you all. So I'm going to jump in with some questions. We had a whole bunch pre-submitted, but if you have others that are coming up for you, feel free to jump in the chat and add things as well, and I'll try and incorporate what I can. Um, so I'm just going to pass right back to Greg and thinking about the accountability around the fossil fuel companies. So we've had a lot of people asking about subsidies, what it takes to stop new fossil fuel approvals, how fossil fuel executives reconcile their work with their kids' future. And across all of them, there's this sort of underlying frustration that fossil fuel interests keep getting away with polluting unchecked. Um, is accountability, Greg, getting any closer or is it getting further away? And what do you think is their kryptonite in the race to net zero?
Um, it's an interesting question overall, and I haven't thought about kryptonite for a while. But look, the first thing I'd say is um, so many people in the fossil fuel industries, oil and gas industries, are basically, whether you call it the coal face or whatever else, they're engineers, they're stewards, they're all sorts of different people. It's when you get to the top of the organizations, which is basically the chief executives, that senior management and the board, that is where you have to actually work. At that particular level, that is where the negotiating and the putting on boxing gloves with governments of different countries happens. That is the really nasty place. That's where it is what you might call amoral. It's neither immoral or moral, but it's amoral. The basic tenet of the companies has always been, I think it was as Milton Friedman, the economist, said, the first and only responsibility is to make money for your shareholders. But there have been so many people over many years saying, no, we have responsibilities to society. And that conversation must come on again and again and again, because there is no doubt about it in my mind. There's more than 100 years of experience, which basically says the boards and chief executives of these companies do not give a damn about society. It's just about profits. And how do you make sure those profits keep coming? So we have to call it as we see it. We then go to the relationship with governments, of course. Too often governments have fallen over themselves just to get a bit of jobs here, a few jobs there, to help out this or help out that. But in actual fact, they've, sold their soul to the devil. We must just continue exposing the fact that the oil companies are in this for themselves, for their personal pockets, for their international profits, and talk it as it is. Um, Transparency again becomes key. Shining a light on it becomes key. Uh, Organizations like ours and the Climate Council pointing out the facts, not the slogans that come out of Shell or BP or Inpex or any of the other companies. Shining the light on the facts becomes absolutely critical. We need your help.
Thanks, Greg. To pass on to you, Alex, the sort of the next step in this kind of question around the revolving door of politicians taking well-paid jobs in the fossil fuel sector executives coming and working in political offices. The Greg mentioned in his presentation just the intensive lobbying that is kind of non-stop, as well as the massive public campaigns. Um, and of course, the flip side, how do we make sure if they're hearing a lot from the fossil fuel industry, how do we dampen that? But how do we make sure politicians are hearing the voice from the community? Can you comment on that, Alex?
Yeah, sure. This is a real pet peeve of mine. So I'll try and keep it short. But like I would say, I've worked in sort of politics and advocacy for a long time, both inside of government and outside. And it's not just the fossil fuel industry that is good at this, although they have particular expertise. It's also the tobacco industry in the health space, defense industry, you even see it in housing. So that revolving door is a problem across our politics and our democracy. I think there are some settings in place, but this is something that's really hard to regulate. Ultimately, there's some rules about, you can't work in a certain area, or you can't have contact with a certain political office that you worked in for like a year after you leave it. Those things are only ever going to be so effective. It's quite hard to regulate. You can't regulate personal relationships, networks that date back often to school or university years, or political party networks. It's really hard to regulate those. So I think transparency is what's really key. So, okay, people are going to get these jobs whether we like it or not or think it's appropriate, but having transparency around who these people are, who they've worked for, who they're meeting with, what are they meeting with them on, how many times are they meeting with them, that is really what's missing in Australian politics at the moment. I think, there's definitely a move, I think, being spearheaded by Senator David Pocock. That's a voluntary list of lobbyists that people, essentially MPs can and political parties can voluntarily register which passes or lobbyists they've given passes to. This should be mandatory. But Australians calling for that is a useful thing that people can do, because that transparency is ultimately what helps us, make that system that's currently dark, bring it into the light and hold some accountability there. I think something that's always struck me as well is on like political advisors. This network of political advisors that work in political offices. There's no register of their names. No one knows who they are. They revolve in and out of the party political systems. I believe there should also be transparency around who these advisors are, their names and their experience and who they're working for. In terms of like hearing voice from the community, I think, there's multiple ways that people can make their voices heard. Obviously, you can vote, but in between that, you can sign petitions, contact your MP. You can join political parties, the Labor Party, the Greens Party, the Liberal National Coalition parties. Act like I think Australians' tendency is to like not like politicians and not like our systems, but actually, if we engage with them, you can influence them. I think contacting your MP, there's multiple ways to do that now. You can meet them, you can write to them, you can contact them on social media. You'd be surprised about the number of MPs I talk to that say, "Oh, I haven't heard about that from my community," or "I have heard a lot about this," and that's influencing how they're thinking about things and how they're talking to their colleagues in their party about certain issues. So, I think there's multiple ways that you can do that. I was struck, just to share a final anecdote, by a media story I saw today about Premier Malinauskas down in the South Australian Premier, who had a soccer dad come up to him at his son's football game and say, "Hey, Steve, what do you think about this gas tax?" So he's seeing that, like, okay, there's this soccer dad that knows about this thing. Oh, maybe like it's hit kind of a wide base in the community. So you'd be surprised about where your influence can occur, and how it can affect politicians.
Yeah, we sometimes forget, don't we, that politicians are human beings too, and that the assessment that they make about what people think is not just from the focus group testing and the other things, but it's about their daily experience. And so the more that we can make it a surround sound experience of their daily life in hearing these issues and hearing what the community believes is really important, because that's what the fossil fuel industry is applying. That's why when you arrive in Canberra Airport, there's always a huge amount of fossil fuel advertising in that airport. Um, and it contrasts, like you arrive in Hobart, you don't see that, but you do in Canberra Airport. Um, uh, come to you, Dinah, and into sort of the communication space again. We've had several people submitting questions about how to communicate effectively, how to make climate change less abstract, more connected to people's daily life, whether that's about nature, whether that's about our kids, how to counter the fear and doubt, and but also the long-term nature of how this crisis is rolling out. Even though we are feeling it now, it can feel long-term versus the immediacy of something like cost of living. and what role creators, educators, all of us in the work that we do can make an impact?
It's a big question.
Mm.
I mean, I always like to start with shared values, and depending on who you are and what you hold dear, and depending on who it is you're trying to communicate with, like I think it's hard to find two people that don't actually share a value. So that might be around fairness, it might be family, care, community. There's going to be something that crosses divides more than you actually would expect. And I think that focusing on your specific experience or personal storytelling is a way to traverse populations that facts can often come up against a brick wall. So what we're seeing, I think, at the moment is that stories that build the strength or an idea of us, which is neighbors, families, parents, friends, workers against a them, which is big business, are really powerful because it's really tapping into what most of us are experiencing and feeling at the moment, which is life is tougher. And we understand that it's typically the actions of large corporations, including oil, gas, and coal corporations, that are driving this. So we saw that through the campaigning for an effective tax on gas exports. And that was really summed up in both the image of beer and the idea that beer drinkers are paying higher taxes than the gas industry. Beer is a symbol of the everyday man or woman. You can find it anywhere. It was the drink of the poorer worker. And so that really sort of says to people, hang on, this situation isn't right. And we also saw it recently in terms of an opinion piece from a farmer in WA who was really sick as a farmer of being lumped together with ginormous global corporations, mining corporations, as a shield to argue that they should keep receiving the diesel tax rebate. So I think there's a wealth of empowering stories to tap into in our community right now when it comes to all the solutions that we need to see more of. It could be farmers banding together to operate a wind farm that they directly benefit from that shields them against drought. It could be solar owners who sign up to actually share their power with their neighbour who lives in an apartment and can't put solar on their roof. It might be a community organisation for pensioners that is saving fuel costs because they've got an electric van that they can ferry around their clients in. And those kind of stories are really awesome for two reasons, because they are a solution, but they're also about people working together or helping each other out. And I feel like a lot of us need that right now. The other thing that I feel cuts through in a way that often other approaches don't is just humor. And I think when you approach things with a sense of humor, even if that is irony, again, I feel like that brings people with you and together to get across your point.
Thanks, Dinah. Um, Alex, we've had a bunch of questions around the resurgent right, and that's on a lot of people's minds, particularly because climate change features pretty heavily in a lot of the commentary. So, One Nation, in your slide, you showed One Nation wants to scrap all climate action. The coalition has been quite reactive to the rise of One Nation, as well as the loss of its more moderate seats, and in becoming, scrapping net zero, threatening to scrap the safeguard mechanism and other things. So what is your assessment of the challenge from the rise of the right and what it means for both the public narrative, the political narrative, and the policies that we can actually get through the parliament?
Yeah, look, it's a big question. I think it's something that we're very live to. I think Australia, in some ways, Australia is a little bit behind kind of the EU and the US in this resurgence. But I would also caution that Australia, I maintain this, we are watching this very closely. I think we are very live to it. I think ultimately this has come about in Australia because the Liberals and the National Coalition were ultimately caught quite flat-footed. They lost their moderates, and they were fighting on two flanks and have ultimately kind of tried to save their right flank and headed more conservative. I think that's to our net loss collectively as a nation. So, I think, come on, guys, let's do better on that side. But I think we are fundamentally a different situation to the likes of the US. We have compulsory voting here. We don't have a presidential race in the same way that requires, we still have problems with cash in our politics and political advertising, yes, but it's nowhere near what it is in the US. So we do have a very different situation here. I would say we are very live to it. I think the coalitions and organizations that we work with are very live to it. We're trying to get as much data as we can. We watch very closely what happened at the South Australian election. We watch very closely what just recently happened in Farah. We'll be doing the same and testing things in the Victorian state election along with others. I think we need to really understand why this shift is happening, who these voters are that are shifting their votes and why. I think we are, some way to getting a good evidence base about that. But what's really clear is that the resurgent right is really targeting quite actively, voters in areas with high unemployment, certain age groups, certain backgrounds. And there are reasons why there is a disaffection in those groups with Australian politics as it is now. And we need to understand that in order to be able to communicate effectively and combat this resurgence in the far right. And some of the stuff Diana's just talked about is a way to do that, meeting people with where they are and not kind of falling into the trap of not talking about climate change and not talking about climate solutions because we think they won't resonate with those communities. It's about changing the way we talk about them so that they are resonating with those communities and those voters. So that's kind of the way we're thinking about it. I think it's one to watch. I think we need to be very alive to it ongoing, but I would say that we are very actively preparing for it, and we'll be definitely well prepared in advance of the upcoming federal election for that in the Australian context.
Greg, there's a discussion in the chat around the diesel fuel rebate and other subsidies to fossil fuels. And it's one of those areas where it's the government pulling in two directions, supporting renewables on the one hand and supporting fossil fuels on the other hand. Can you talk to us, and Alex, you might want to jump in on this as well, around the subsidies that are provided for fossil fuels and this kind of emerging campaign that's been led by Fortescue to move away from subsidizing diesel use in mining companies and encouraging mining companies to instead electrify, and why that's important.
Um, Briefly, and then Alice can come in as well. But the way I look at it is, the diesel rebates have been there for a very, very long time, and for us in Australia, it's, broadly because we have such a vast land, diesel has been so important to us, both in the agricultural sector and in the mining sector, and it was difficult to shift products and so on like that. It's basically outdone its life as we now move towards a renewable energy driven sector in transportation as well. And it will happen, there's no doubt about it. So the question is not if, it's when and how do you reduce it? Because to cut it completely to a farmer, for example, is probably not going to happen. If Twiggy Forest can help, in the pace of bringing on, some of the electric magnificent trucks that they actually have in the mining industry, at the same time talking down the reduction that would be required, that becomes really, really important. But you cannot change, let's face it, you can't change a tractor fleet if you're a farmer overnight into an EV tractors. You can't do it in the mining sector. So it has to be a transition. So it's not about if, as I say, it's when and how fast can you pace it. That really is the debate. How fast can we pace the change and push it through? My own view, and a number of you have heard me say this before, we've got to embrace the future, not just hug the past. That means letting go.
Hmm. Did you want to jump in on that too, Alex?
Yeah, look, I would just highlight and I look forward to engaging more with those in our community on this as we do more work on it over the coming months. But this is one of those kind of silver linings of this crisis where I think there's an opportunity here open that wasn't there before. 6 months ago,
Yeah.
most Australians didn't even know they were paying any excise on their fuel. Now they know, and certainly by 30 June, when it gets slapped on and they're paying more, they will know. So I think it will resonate now for the community, particularly as like diesel supply will inevitably become, restricted over the coming months as the crisis continues. It will be a live conversation about who has access to the diesel and who doesn't. And our largest mining companies use a lot of it. They also are using it with a subsidy in the billions. It's one of our top 20 federal budget lines. So I think the case for government to not do the reform will just be reduced and reduced as this, the further this crisis goes on. I would say we are up against, big lobby groups. Rio and BHP are two of Australia's largest companies that are opposing the reform, even in a model that gives them some of the money back to electrify. So that's what we're up against. But we certainly think there's a very open door and a live opportunity to get government to make this reform in the next 6 to 12 months.
Mm. Thanks, thanks, Alex. Dinah, a quick one to kind of, we've been having this big conversation that has consistently talking about the economy, and it really comes in your presentation about economic fairness. And one of the questions we got prior to the webinar was there's so much conversation consistently about, oh, well, what is the cost of acting on climate change? Is it all too much? Versus, well, what is the impact on people's daily life and those extremes that make things very difficult? And how do we get the conversation about the economy more centered around that economic cost to people from climate change?
Yeah, well, it's certainly been a really successful strategy for the fossil fuel industry for a very long time to loudly and repeatedly link any kind of climate solution to cost. And they obviously ignore the inconvenient truth that climate is not only going to be the hugest cost impost on us all into the future, but is actually pushing up things like insurance and our power prices right now. So it's been something that the Climate Council has tried to focus a lot of our work on in bringing in raising and elevating the fact that impacts are here, they are worsening today, and that is coming at a really big personal cost to many people and communities, and a financial cost to us all. Whether your house is hit by flood or fires, whenever there is extreme weather anywhere, insurance costs go up everywhere. So we should all remember that. But I think in this moment, what is most persuasive and compelling for people is the fact that our solutions are going to give them the most immediate direct relief and a sense of agency and control back. And I think that is the most compelling reason for people, and that is what we need to be talking about. The fact that renewable energy and storage is the only thing driving down our power prices, and the fact that most people don't know that, well, maybe that's not a surprise because all our bills have been going up. And the reason they're going up, guess who? Corporations, oil, gas, and coal. And coal is breaking down more often. That price spikes our power. Gas is super expensive. So even though it provides only 5% of our power needs, it's setting the price 50 to 90% of the time. So that is, again, a story that we need to be talking about a lot, so that more and more people understand how they're getting screwed over, really.
Thanks, Dinah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I wanted to just quickly share a response to a question that we get very frequently, and I think we all do on this panel. How do you stay hopeful when it feels like we're up against such enormous challenges? And I think for me, there's two things. The first is looking back. This year is my 20th year of working on climate change. And when I started, there was about 1,000 odd panels on homes in Australia, and now there's over 4 million. At that time, there was a very small proportion of our grid powered by renewables. Now we're at 45%. And you can look back and see this amazing social, economic, technological change that is happening here and around the world. And it's only been achieved because literally millions of people are working on this every day, trying to get the change to happen. And although it is a determined fight from the other side, I believe we will win. It's just a question of elevating the pace, and that will determine that whether that win is sufficient, I suppose. And so Christiana Figueres, we met, I think it was last week or the week before, she was in Australia, and she has this amazing message of stubborn optimism, which is that pessimism, you're bound to lose. Optimism, you're at least on the pathway that you can win. She was one of the architects of the Paris Agreement that looked very improbable at the start, but I was at the meeting when that gavel went down, improbably a on an agreement from countries all around the world. 10 years on, it's created enormous change around the world. So I think we all have to maintain that stubborn optimism. Um, so I hope that everything you've heard tonight has been really interesting, the playbook, the policy fights, the work to shift the conversation. That's what we do every day, and we do it because we've got the backing of you, people like you all around the country. We're 100% independent, community funded. We don't take any money from government or corporations because that independence is critical to holding decision makers to account, to calling out the fossil fuel influence and telling the truth about what's happening without needing to pull any punches. So we're currently running our end of financial year appeal right now. Our goal is to raise $500,000 by 30 June to power our work in the year ahead. So if you're able to contribute in any way to what we're describing as the Climate Fairness Fund, that would make a huge difference to the work that we do. So if you're able to, would love you to be a part of it. This is all that we've got time for tonight. So thank you so much to Dinah, to Greg, to Alex. Obviously, they're so intelligent and they bring so much perspective to all the conversations and work we have at the Climate Council. Um, I'm so grateful for what they bring, and thank you for being here, for participating, and for potentially sharing this with your friends and colleagues. When we send out the summary of the event, as I mentioned, we'll have all the links that were in the chat as well as a post-event survey, so you can tell us anything you think we could improve for future events or other people that you would like to hear from. So we will leave it there, and thank you, and I hope you have a lovely night ahead. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.